Well, it was a bit naughty of me, wasn't it, getting the mayor to read that lesson from Samuel. Let's think a little bit about what it might have to say to us, because whenever we open the Bible, it speaks to us. It challenges us. Sometimes people talk about it reading us, as though it reads into our lives, and from it we can learn what God requires of us. There's no getting away from the fact that there are people who stand quite firmly on either side of the debate about monarchy. There are, for example, those who joined us yesterday, waving flags and ringing bells and joining together as we played the coronation here on our giant screen to watch the coronation, enthusiastically supporting the king and therefore the principle of monarchy. Now, that's often because those who support the monarchy see it as the only viable alternative to a republican system. Supporters of an English republican dream, well, they have this vision of electing somebody wise, a wise national treasure, like David Attenborough or Judi Dench to be our president, don't they? Yeah. My fear, I have to tell you, is that a populist vote amongst the general population is not very likely to do David Attenborough. We'd probably end up with Simon Cowell or Anton Deck or something, wouldn't we? The fact is, if we were designing a nation from scratch, it would be ludicrous to give all that power and influence to one random family, wouldn't it? But we're not starting from scratch. Our constitutional monarchy has evolved over centuries. It's become a kind of screen onto which we project our sense of self, our national identity, our national ethics of service in particular. But as a Christian, I'm compelled to ask what the Bible's view of monarchy is. Unfortunately, it's a bit ambiguous, to say the least. In that first reading that I somewhat tricked Diana into reading, although she kindly agreed to do so, we're confronted with a God who, it seems, is implacably opposed to Israel having a king. He warns the people that if they have a king, then he's going to take all their wealth for himself and send their sons off into battle for his own political aims. And lots of other ways in which the king would appropriate the wealth of the nation to himself. But the God in this portion of the Bible is a God who can be argued with. And eventually, in the story, he relents. And he permits, almost it's a bit grudgingly, he sort of all right, you can have a king then, if you really, really want one. But from that point onwards, until the exile from Jerusalem and into Babylon, God appears to be broadly content with the idea of monarchy. The Old Testament picture, it shows us that he blesses Saul, the first king of Israel, and then David, and then David's son Solomon. Kings after them were, they were a pretty mixed bag, it seems. That some of them led the people away from the worship of God and even to worship other idols. The books of the Kings, if you're ever interested to read through them, are full of descriptions of various kings who, quote, did evil in the sight of God. Others led people back to God, re-established religious practices, rebuilt temples, and so forth. Ultimately, the monarchy was lost by the people of Israel when the leaders of Israel were carried off into Babylon during the period known as the exile. By the time of Jesus, Israel has a vassal king, the notorious Herod the Great, and then his sons. Now, those vassals, those monarchs, were actually subject to the emperor, to Caesar, who claimed dominion over all of Israel. Jesus, interestingly, recognizes Caesar's earthly authority. I'm sure you'll remember when he famously advises his followers to render unto Caesar and to God those things which are respectively theirs, yeah? And then later, after Jesus, St. Paul commends his followers to pray for all those who are in authority. And Paul makes the startling claim that all earthly authorities, including kings and emperors, are established by God. That should give Diana and Alan pause for thought this morning, I bet. All earthly authority established by God. It's from such teachings as that the notion of the divine right of kings comes from. So, the Bible's feels like it's not much help, doesn't it, on these issues? It presents an ambiguous picture, a range of views about monarchy. And we can draw on those images, those pictures, those stories to make up our own minds. On the one hand, Samuel was absolutely right about the tendency of monarchs to appropriate the resources of a nation to themselves. Just one quick statistic, in the UK, for example, the Crown Estate owns, I calculated, over 1,000 square miles of countryside. Now, Republicans would like to strip the monarchy of that land and make it available to the people for the building of homes and hospitals and businesses. Others argue that many of the Crown's lands are, in fact, wild moorland and coastline, which the monarch preserves on behalf of the nation and keeps from the hands of voracious property barons. Oh, these are hard arguments, aren't they? The life of our late Queen reassures many people that monarchy done well can be a stabilizing and yet prophetic force within the life of a nation. A wise monarch has the power to bring people together, to speak wise words of comfort in times of crisis. Who can forget how Her Majesty spoke to us in the middle of COVID, for example? And a wise monarch can provide wise but private challenge to prime ministers, who seem to come and go with increasingly frequency at the moment. King Charles has often been a leader in our national debates. Famously, he was worried about the environment 20 years before David Attenborough started to worry about it. As the progenitor of the Prince's Trust, Charles was working to level up the nation decades before that particular phrase entered our modern political lexicon. As an enthusiastic patron of the arts, let's remember he commissioned 12 living composers to compose music for his coronation yesterday. He has constantly reminded us that from the arts, from comedy, from drama, music, and from representational art and painting and sculpture, from those things come dreams and visions of who God calls us to be. Our gospel reading offers us another lens through which we can view the monarchy. Jesus interferes in an argument with between his disciples about who's going to be the greatest of them in the kingdom of heaven. You can imagine it, can't you? They're all sitting around, oh, I'm more important than you. Jesus loves me more than you. He always asked me to do the jobs. Therefore, I'm definitely his favorite. So I'm going to sit at his right hand in heaven. Don't you think? Yeah? And Jesus gets in the middle of all that. And he promises his disciples that, yes, one day they will sit upon thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, but he does so after making very clear that the role of any leader is primarily to be a servant. We sometimes forget, don't we, that the word minister, applied both to people like me and to people in government, means servant. To minister is to serve. And the king is called to be the minister to us all. Indeed, much of yesterday's coronation service ritual was designed to reinforce that point. He was anointed and clothed as a priest before ascending the throne. Jesus came to us in his own words, to be served. Sorry, not to be served, but to serve, yeah? Which was exactly the phrase that the king used after that small boy welcomed him to the service at the very beginning. I found that very moving, and I see a lot of nods suggesting that many of you did as well. You see, service is the model that the king has called us to follow as well. As he leads us into lives of service to one another. For all his lands and palaces, for all his crown jewels and private wealth, the king carries a heavy burden of responsibility, doesn't he? There is, in fact, very little of his life that I would envy. Imagine, for example, having the ultimate responsibility for the management of 1,000 square miles of land. I find it stressful enough having responsibility for 2 or 3 acres of land here in Havant. Yeah, 1,000 square miles of it. The king has responsibilities thrust upon him that most other billionaires around the world can't even imagine. Not for the king, the life of endless parties on yachts, or the freedom to play about with space rockets. No. For the king, each day is consumed with service, with government business, with endless correspondence, with the challenge of meeting the expectations of a sometimes fractious and fractured nation. He may do so from a position of wealth and privilege, but as previous monarchs have described it, the trappings of monarchy are, in fact, a gilded cage. I believe, therefore, that the king deserves our respect and our gratitude. You are at liberty to disagree with me, because we live in a free country that the king governs over. But I say it would have been easy for King Charles to have walked away from the duties of monarchy. He could have abdicated in favor of his younger son, but he chose to shoulder the burden and to take on to himself in a very public and iconic way the role of a servant, inspiring and challenging all of us to do the same. And so, my friends, whether we are monarchists or republicans, I believe he deserves, at the very least, our sincere thanks and our most heartfelt prayers. Amen? God save the King.